He never saw it coming.
Marcus Calloway buried his father on a Tuesday morning in October. By Tuesday afternoon, he was standing in a lawyer's office learning that he no longer owned a single brick of the company his father had spent 40 years building. Not one share, not $1. Not even the old pickup truck his father had promised him since he was 16 years old. Everything, the freight company, the warehouses, the accounts, the house on Miller Creek Road, had been signed over to his brother 4 months before their father died. Marcus sat in that leather chair and said nothing. He didn't cry, he didn't argue. He simply listened, and somewhere behind his eyes, something quietly and permanently changed. What Marcus didn't know that afternoon was that this was only the beginning. Over the next 18 months, he would uncover a plan so calculated, so patient, that it would make him question everything he thought he understood about his own family. His brother hadn't gotten lucky. His brother had built a trap, one document at a time, over 2 long years, while their father's mind slowly slipped away. And by the time Marcus figured out exactly what had happened, he wasn't interested in winning back an inheritance anymore. He wanted something else entirely, and what he eventually did to get it would leave his brother's entire life in ruins. This is the story of how a quiet, overlooked younger son took apart his own brother's world, piece by piece, using nothing but patience, paperwork, and the same trust his brother had once weaponized against him. It is a true story in its bones, pulled from the same pattern investigators and elder law attorneys across this country see again and again, a pattern where trust becomes the weapon and family becomes the target. The names and the exact events here are not the real ones, but the machinery behind them is very, very real, and once you understand how it works, you may never look at a quiet, devoted sibling the same way again. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how far this went, you have to understand 3 people, and the strange, quiet arithmetic that existed between them long before anyone signed a single document. Raymond Calloway was a self-made man who built a regional trucking company from a single leased truck into a business worth close to $19 million. Derek Calloway was the older son, the one who stayed close to home, worked inside the company, and positioned himself, patiently and deliberately, as the only child their father could still rely on. And Marcus Calloway was the younger son, the one who moved 2 states away to build a career of his own, and who, according to the story Derek told anyone willing to listen, had abandoned the family the moment it actually mattered. That story was a lie, but it was a useful one, and Derek told it so often, to so many people, that by the time their father's health began to fail, almost everyone around him believed it. Almost everyone, including, in the end, Raymond himself. So here are the questions this story is going to answer for you, one piece of evidence at a time. How does a healthy, sharp, financially disciplined 71-year-old man end up signing away his entire estate to one child and absolutely nothing to the other? What role did the woman hired to care for him in his final 2 years actually play in all of this? And when Marcus finally uncovered the truth, buried under 2 years of paperwork and small, deliberate lies, why did he choose not to walk into a courtroom and instead spend 18 months quietly building something far more devastating than any lawsuit could ever be? Raymond Calloway grew up with almost nothing. His own father worked freight docks in Toledo for 30 years and never once owned a home of his own. Raymond swore, even as a teenager loading crates in the cold, that his life would look different. And by the age of 26, he had saved enough to buy a single-used delivery truck and a handful of local hauling contracts. He named the business Calloway Freight and Storage, and for the next 4 decades he ran it exactly the way he ran everything else in his life, with total control, long, unforgiving hours, and an almost religious belief that hard work solved every problem a person could ever face. By the time Raymond turned 60, Calloway Freight had 11 warehouses spread across 3 states, a fleet of 60 trucks, and a payroll of over 200 employees who depended on him. He was, by any honest measure, a wealthy man. He was also, according to both of his sons, never an easy man to love. Eleanor Calloway was the softer half of that marriage, the one who remembered birthdays, softened her husband's temper, and translated his silences into something the boys could understand as love rather than distance. She died of a stroke when Marcus was 26, and Derek was 29, and something in the family's fragile balance died along with her. Raymond had never been especially warm to begin with, but Eleanor had always stood between him and his sons, explaining him to them. Without her, Raymond became harder and harder to reach, and both of his sons responded to that sudden distance in two very different ways, without ever fully realizing how far apart those two paths would eventually take them. Derek responded by moving closer, both physically and emotionally. He was already working at Callaway Freight in a junior operations role at the time of their mother's death, and within a single year, he had folded himself completely into his father's daily routine. Lunches twice a week, weekend visits that never seemed to end, long phone calls about absolutely nothing in particular. On the surface, this looked exactly like devotion, the kind any parent would be lucky to receive from a grown child. And for a while, it may genuinely have been just that. But Derek was also, even from a fairly young age, someone who understood with real precision how to make himself indispensable to powerful people, and his own father was, without question, the most powerful person he had ever known in his life. Marcus responded to that same grief very differently. He had never wanted to spend his life running trucks, and after Eleanor's funeral, he took a job 2 states away designing bridge retrofits for a state transportation department, work he had studied for in college against his father's mild but very persistent disapproval. It was not, in any real sense, a rejection of his family. It was simply the life he had quietly built for himself, a life his father never fully understood and, if he was honest with himself, never fully respected either. Marcus called every single Sunday without fail. He flew home for every holiday he could manage. He was not, by any fair or honest measure, an absent son in the way the story would later be told about him. But distance is remarkably easy for someone determined enough to reframe. And Derek reframed it constantly, in small comments dropped casually at family dinners, and in larger, sharper ones dropped whenever Marcus happened to be out of the room. For years, none of this quiet resentment mattered very much, because Raymond remained healthy, sharp, and firmly in control of every decision in his own life. He ran the company personally from his office on Route 9, well into his late 60s, reviewing every major contract himself, sitting in on every important client meeting, trusting almost no one else with the fine print of anything that carried his name. Marcus remembers this particular version of his father with real fondness. Stubborn, difficult at times, but undeniably his own man, right up until the end of that chapter. That is not, however, the man who eventually signed away everything he had spent his life building. Something began to change the year Raymond turned 70, and it changed slowly enough that almost nobody around him noticed until it was already far, far too late to undo. It started with small things, the kind families explain away without even realizing they are doing it. Raymond forgot the name of a client he had known personally for 15 years. He repeated the exact same story twice within a single dinner, word for word, with no memory whatsoever of having told it only 20 minutes earlier. He got lost driving home one afternoon from a hardware store he had visited weekly for well over a decade, a route he could once have driven with his eyes closed. Derek was the one who noticed these moments most consistently, simply because Derek was the one who was physically there most often. And Derek made a decision in that period that would quietly define everything that followed for the next 2 years. Instead of raising the alarm with Marcus, instead of pushing their father toward a proper diagnosis the entire family could plan around together as one unit, Derek began keeping the details almost entirely to himself. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. He told himself, at least in the beginning, that he was simply protecting his father's dignity. Raymond had always been a fiercely private man, and the idea of his own decline becoming a topic openly discussed and dissected by extended relatives genuinely embarrassed him. Derek used that discomfort as a kind of cover for himself. He began handling doctor's appointments alone, without telling anyone the details. He fielded phone calls from concerned old friends of the family and gave them reassuring, deliberately vague answers designed to end the conversation quickly. And when Marcus called every Sunday and asked, as he always did, how their father was really doing, Derek told him, almost every single time, that everything was completely fine. It was not fine. Over the following 18 months, Raymond's memory continued to erode in ways that became increasingly difficult to hide from anyone paying close attention. He signed a check to the wrong vendor, twice. He forgot he had already paid his property taxes for the year and paid them again in full. These were small, fixable things, the kind of things a family can absorb and manage together when everyone involved actually knows what is happening. But Derek had, slowly and almost accidentally at first, built himself into the only filter through which any information about their father passed to the outside world. And he had done it so gradually, so reasonably, one small justification at a time, that nobody around him, not the extended family, not Raymond's old friends, and certainly not Marcus, 800 miles away, ever thought to seriously question it. It was during this exact period that Renee Doyle entered the picture for the first time. Derek hired her, using company funds routed through the business, to work as a part-time home health aide for their father, 3 days a week at first, ostensibly just to help with meals and medication schedules, while Derek was busy at the office running the daily operations of the freight company. Renee was capable, pleasant, and genuinely good at her job in the narrowest possible sense of the phrase. She was also, almost from the very beginning, deeply loyal to Derek rather than to Raymond himself, for the simple reason that it was Derek who had hired her, Derek who paid her salary every 2 weeks, and Derek who could end her employment at any single moment he chose to. That loyalty would end up mattering enormously later in this story. For now, it simply meant that Raymond had a third person permanently embedded in his daily life, and like the other 2 people closest to him, she answered to Derek first, before anyone else. Marcus flew home for Thanksgiving that year and noticed the changes in his father almost immediately upon walking through the door. His father repeating simple questions within minutes, losing his train of thought in the middle of ordinary sentences, growing irritated in ways that felt entirely new and unfamiliar to the man Marcus had known his whole life. He raised it privately with Derek in the kitchen that same evening, well away from their father's hearing. Derek's answer came smooth and immediate, almost rehearsed. It was just normal aging, nothing at all to worry about. Their father had already seen a doctor and everything had checked out completely fine. Marcus wanted, more than almost anything, to believe that answer. Derek was right there living it every single day, and Marcus was 800 miles away, with a demanding full-time job and a young family of his own to manage. So Marcus did what a great many people in his exact position do when someone they love tells them not to worry. He trusted his brother completely. That trust is the hinge this entire story turns on, and it is worth sitting with for a moment before we move forward. Everything that happened over the following 2 years, every document quietly signed, every account carefully restructured, every visit Marcus was gently and repeatedly discouraged from making in person, depended entirely on one single thing holding steady without ever cracking. Marcus's unshakable belief that his brother, whatever his flaws might be, would never actually lie to him about something as serious as their father's health and well-being. Derek understood that particular belief better than almost anyone alive, because he had grown up alongside it his entire life. And slowly, deliberately, one small reassurance at a time, he began to use it against the one person who trusted him most. There is one more piece of history worth knowing before the real turn in this story begins, and it concerns the company itself, not just the family. Callaway Freight and Storage was structured, on paper, as a 50-50 arrangement between the 2 brothers. Raymond had updated his estate plan a full decade earlier, long before any of this began, deliberately splitting future ownership evenly between Marcus and Derek, regardless of who happened to work inside the business on a day-to-day basis. Raymond had been explicit about this decision with both of his sons and with the family's longtime attorney at the time. He believed, in his own blunt and old-fashioned way, that blood mattered more than job titles, and that Marcus's chosen career in engineering did not make him any less his son in the eyes of the family business. Derek had never been fully at peace with that particular arrangement, even if he rarely said so out loud. He was, after all, the one showing up to the office every single day, learning every delivery route by heart, managing exhausted drivers, absorbing the constant stress of a demanding business their father refused to ever fully hand over control of. Marcus, from where Derek stood, got to keep his entirely separate life, his separate career, his separate identity, 2 states away, and still walk away one day with half of everything their father had spent a lifetime building. It was, in Derek's private telling of the story to himself, deeply and fundamentally unfair. He never said this openly to Marcus, not once. He barely even admitted it fully to himself for a long time, but it sat there quietly for years, hardening slowly into something else entirely. A growing conviction that if the right opportunity ever presented itself, the 50-50 split their father had always insisted on was a mistake genuinely worth correcting, by whatever means became available. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Raymond's slow decline handed Derek exactly the opportunity he had never quite let himself imagine before. And once Renee Doyle was inside that house every single day, and once Derek had carefully made himself the only reliable narrator of his father's true condition to the rest of the family, the pieces were already, quietly and almost invisibly, falling into place around a man who no longer had the ability to notice. The first real move happened 11 months after Renee Doyle was hired, and it was so small at the time that nobody outside that house even noticed it happening. Derek began driving their father to appointments personally, instead of letting Renee handle the logistics, and one of those appointments was with a brand new physician, not Raymond's longtime doctor of over 20 years, a man who knew him well, but a specialist Derek had personally found himself, at a clinic nearly 40 minutes away from the house. The official reason given was that this new doctor specialized specifically in geriatric memory care. The unofficial effect, whether intended from the very start or not, was that this particular doctor had no history whatsoever with Raymond, no baseline understanding of who he used to be, even 5 years earlier, and absolutely no relationship with Marcus at all. That doctor's clinical notes, obtained by Marcus much later, described Raymond consistently as alert, cooperative, and fully oriented, technically accurate on his better days, and carefully, almost suspiciously timed, appointment after appointment, to fall precisely on those better days. Derek learned his father's patterns quickly, and used that knowledge with real discipline. Mornings were noticeably sharper than afternoons. The days following a full, uninterrupted night of sleep were sharper than the days following a restless one. Every single appointment with this new doctor was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, without exception, and Renee made absolutely sure Raymond slept well every Monday night leading into it. None of this, taken piece by piece, was illegal on its own. All of it together was quietly designed to produce a very specific kind of paper trail, one that would become extremely useful later. Around this same period, Marcus began noticing that his Sunday phone calls with his father were growing shorter and stranger by the week. Raymond would drift completely mid-conversation, forget entirely what they had just been discussing moments earlier, occasionally call Marcus by the name of an uncle who had passed away decades earlier. When Marcus raised this again with Derek, more urgently this time, Derek's story shifted only slightly, just enough to sound reasonable. Their father was fine, simply tired. The new specialist said his memory tests looked entirely normal for a man of his age. Nothing at all to genuinely worry about. Marcus asked, more than once and with growing insistence, whether he should fly in and sit in personally on one of these appointments himself. Derek always managed to have a reason it wasn't quite the right time. The doctor was fully booked that week. Their father had come down with a cold and didn't want visitors around him. The timing somehow never once worked out. 6 months after that conversation, Derek asked their father to sign what he casually described, almost in passing, as an update to some of the account paperwork, a phrase vague enough to comfortably mean almost anything at all. In reality, it was the very first of 3 separate documents that would eventually restructure the entirety of Raymond's estate, piece by piece, over the following 2 years. The family's longtime attorney, the man who had personally drafted the original 50-50 trust a full decade earlier, was notably not the one who prepared this new document. Derek had quietly and deliberately moved his father's affairs over to a different attorney entirely, a solo practitioner working out of a small strip mall office who had absolutely no prior relationship with the family, no institutional memory of what Raymond had originally wanted years earlier, and, as would eventually come to light, a troubling habit of taking Derek's word for what his father supposedly wanted without asking Raymond many direct questions of his own. That first document quietly removed Marcus as co-trustee of his father's estate entirely, replacing him with Derek alone as sole trustee, under the stated rationale that having just a single trustee closer to the day-to-day finances would simply be more efficient going forward. Raymond signed it on a Tuesday morning, during his sharpest hour of his sharpest day, with Renee present in the room as a formal witness, and the new attorney reading the document aloud, in a tone Raymond, by every honest account available afterward, only partially followed at the time. Marcus was not told any of this had happened. He would not find out for almost an entire year, long after it no longer made any practical difference. The second document arrived 4 months after that first one. This one quietly adjusted the beneficiary designations on 2 of Raymond's largest financial accounts, not the whole estate just yet, but enough on its own to move roughly $3 million entirely outside the reach of the original family trust, directly into accounts that would pass to Derek alone the moment Raymond died, bypassing probate court completely and bypassing any future dispute over the trust itself. Once again, Raymond signed on a good morning. Once again, Renee witnessed the signing. Once again, Marcus was told absolutely nothing about any of it. The third and final document was the significant one, the one that changed everything permanently. It was a full amendment to the trust itself, signed only 8 weeks before Raymond died, which quietly replaced the original 50-50 split entirely. In its place sat new legal language, claiming that Raymond had developed genuine concerns about his younger son's long-term financial stability and his overall commitment to the family business, and had therefore made the deliberate decision to leave the entirety of Callaway Freight and Storage, along with the family house and every remaining liquid asset, to Derek alone. Marcus was not mentioned by name anywhere in this new trust document, except within a single piece of boilerplate legal language automatically disinheriting any child not specifically named within its pages. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Raymond died 8 weeks later, quietly, in his sleep, of what the official death certificate listed simply as complications from cardiovascular disease. Marcus flew home for the funeral, still believing, exactly as he had believed for the past 2 full years, that his father's estate would eventually be split evenly between himself and his brother, exactly as it always had been for his entire adult life. He stood up and gave a eulogy about a man who valued fairness above almost everything else in this world. Derek sat quietly in the front pew that day and said absolutely nothing. 4 days later, sitting in the family attorney's office, because it was that same longtime attorney, ironically, who still held the original documents on file and had personally insisted on being present when the new trust was formally read aloud to the family, Marcus learned that the father he had just eulogized as a deeply fair man had, according to every piece of paperwork sitting in front of him, deliberately and knowingly cut him out of everything he had ever built. For the first 3 full weeks after that meeting in the attorney's office, Marcus did almost nothing at all. He told friends and coworkers that he was simply processing grief, which was technically true, though not in the way most of them assumed. What he was actually doing, late at night, was replaying 2 entire years of phone calls in his head, searching for the exact moment his own brother had started lying to him outright. He could not find one single moment. That, more than anything else, was the part that frightened him most of all. The lying had never been one single dramatic event he could point to and name. It had been a slow, continuous erosion, so gradual and so patient that no individual phone call had ever felt like an outright lie on its own, even in hindsight. The family attorney was the one who first suggested, carefully and with real professional caution, that something about the final trust amendment simply didn't sit right with him personally. He had drafted the original document a full decade earlier and remembered clearly, with real confidence, how insistent Raymond had always been about the 50-50 split between his 2 sons, no matter what either of them ended up doing with their separate lives. A man who felt that strongly, for that long, rarely reversed himself so completely without an extremely good reason. And the reason listed in the new trust, vague, unspecified concerns about Marcus's financial stability, didn't match a single thing the attorney had ever personally heard Raymond say about his younger son. He couldn't act on that professional instinct directly, but he gave Marcus something far more valuable than simple legal advice. He gave him the name of a skilled forensic accountant, and the name of an elder law attorney who specialized in exactly this kind of quiet, devastating family case. Marcus's very first real move was requesting his father's complete medical records from the new doctor Derek had quietly switched him to 2 years earlier. It took nearly 6 full weeks and a formal written records request to actually obtain them. And when Marcus finally sat down one evening and read through 2 entire years of appointment notes line by line, a pattern jumped out at him almost immediately. Every single appointment, without a single exception, had been scheduled for a Tuesday morning. Every single clinical note described his father as alert and fully oriented. Not one single note anywhere mentioned any of the confusion, repetition, or disorientation Marcus had personally witnessed with his own ears over dozens of Sunday phone calls during that exact same period. Either his father's condition had genuinely and coincidentally fluctuated in a pattern that happened to perfectly align with a fixed weekly appointment schedule, or someone had been very deliberately choosing exactly when to bring him in to be seen. The forensic accountant, a methodical and thorough woman who had spent 15 years professionally untangling exactly this category of estate dispute, found the second major thread in this unraveling case. She carefully traced the 2 beneficiary designation changes on Raymond's largest accounts and uncovered something Marcus had never known existed. A full 18 months before their father's death, Derek had personally taken out a substantial business line of credit against Callaway Freight's own company assets, using his official authority as the company's operations manager, and had used a meaningful portion of those borrowed funds to pay the new attorney directly for legal services rendered to Raymond personally. In plain, simple terms, Derek had used company money belonging to both brothers to pay the very lawyer who was quietly rewriting their father's estate entirely in Derek's favor. It was the kind of isolated detail that, on its own, would never fully prove intent inside a courtroom. But stacked carefully next to everything else Marcus was slowly uncovering, it stopped looking anything like a simple coincidence. Marcus also finally managed to track down Renee Doyle, who had been quietly let go from her position within a single month of Raymond's death, the moment she was no longer useful to Derek in any meaningful way. This turned out to be one of the very few real miscalculations Derek made throughout the entire 2-year plan. Renee had spent 2 full years being underpaid, overworked, and treated, in her own exact words to Marcus over coffee at a diner near her new job, like hired help rather than a person who had genuinely grown fond of the confused, vulnerable old man she cared for every single day. She agreed, somewhat reluctantly at first, to sit down and talk openly with Marcus. Not everything she eventually shared was strictly provable or even legally admissible on its own, but she confirmed the Tuesday morning pattern in full detail, confirmed that Derek had personally coached her more than once on exactly what to say and not say whenever Marcus called, and confirmed that on at least 2 separate occasions, Raymond had asked her, in quiet and clearly confused moments, why Marcus never came to visit him anymore, a question Derek had apparently told his own father was simply untrue, that Marcus had personally chosen to stay away from him. That single detail broke something loose inside Marcus that the financial fraud alone had never quite managed to reach. It was one thing entirely to steal money from a family. It was another thing altogether to tell a dying, confused old man that his own son didn't love him enough to visit, while that exact same son was calling faithfully every single Sunday, being quietly and deliberately steered away every single time he asked to fly in and see him in person. Derek hadn't simply taken the inheritance for himself. He had taken away the last 2 precious years Marcus could have spent with his own father, and he had done it entirely on purpose, because a present, fully informed Marcus was, from the very beginning, the single biggest threat to everything Derek was quietly building for himself. There were real dead ends along the way that cost Marcus significant time and energy he could not easily spare. For a while, he genuinely suspected the new attorney might have been an entirely unwitting participant in all of this, simply careless rather than actively complicit, until financial records surfaced showing the attorney had billed for in-person consultations with Raymond on 2 separate dates, when Raymond's own personal calendar, faithfully kept by Renee, clearly showed he had never once left the house. For a period of time, Marcus also seriously suspected Vanessa, Derek's own wife, might have been the true architect behind the entire plan, since she had a strong professional finance background and had pushed hard, for years, for Derek to take on a bigger formal role inside the company. That particular thread eventually led nowhere concrete. Vanessa, it would eventually turn out, genuinely did not know the full extent of what her husband had done until much later in the story, and her own reaction, once she finally learned the truth, would become one of the most unexpected turns in this entire case. By month 14 of his personal investigation, working largely alone in the evenings after his regular job, Marcus had assembled a file that would have made a genuinely strong civil case for undue influence. Enough, according to the elder law attorney he had formerly hired, to plausibly overturn the final trust amendment in court and restore something very close to the original 50-50 split his father had always intended. A lawsuit of that particular kind typically takes anywhere from 2 to 4 full years to resolve, costs both sides enormous and often ruinous amounts in legal fees, and, whether you ultimately win or lose, permanently and very publicly destroys whatever fragile relationship still remains between the two parties involved. Marcus sat with that heavy option for exactly one long evening alone in his kitchen. And then he made a decision. He did not want his father's money back through a courtroom at all. He wanted something his brother would feel far more directly and far sooner than any lawsuit could ever deliver. Here is what Marcus understood clearly, something most people in his exact position never really stopped to fully consider before acting. A lawsuit would have made him a plaintiff, forced to stand in front of a judge and essentially beg for the return of something that was already rightfully his to begin with. He had absolutely no interest in begging for anything from anyone, least of all his own brother. He wanted Derek to lose the company the exact same way Derek had originally taken it from him, quietly, entirely legally, and completely by his own hand, with no outside intervention required at all. So instead of filing suit through the courts, Marcus spent the next 4 full months doing something far less dramatic on the surface and far more effective underneath it. He began quietly buying debt. The business line of credit Derek had taken out against Callaway Freight's company assets, the same one used to secretly pay the new attorney, carried a financial covenant almost nobody at the company had ever paid close attention to. Buried carefully on page 11 of a lengthy loan agreement Derek had signed without ever reading it closely enough. It required the company to maintain a specific minimum liquidity ratio at all times, and it gave the lender the explicit legal right to call the entire outstanding loan due immediately in full if that ratio was ever meaningfully breached. The forensic accountant, still working closely with Marcus at this point, discovered that Derek, flush with newfound confidence, after finally gaining full control of the entire company, had spent the past year expanding aggressively, opening 2 brand-new warehouses financed entirely on additional borrowed debt, without ever properly checking whether the original loan covenant still held true. It did not hold true. The company had quietly been in technical default for 11 full months, and the regional bank holding that original loan simply had not noticed yet. Marcus did not go directly to the bank himself. That particular move would have looked deeply personal and vindictive, easy for Derek to spin publicly as nothing more than a jealous, bitter brother stirring up trouble out of spite. Instead, Marcus quietly purchased a small position in the loan itself through a legitimate secondary lending arrangement, one the forensic accountant helped him carefully structure, a legal, if somewhat unusual financial move that gave him formal standing as a legitimate creditor, entitled to request a completely routine compliance audit of the company's books. He requested exactly that, and nothing more than that. Just a standard audit. The same kind lenders request on defaulted loans as a matter of everyday business practice, all across the country. The audit did exactly what Marcus had quietly known it would do from the very beginning. It did not simply uncover the liquidity breach on its own. Auditors reviewing a company's full financial books for a covenant default routinely traced the complete history of every major transaction on record, and that meant they inevitably traced the original line of credit directly back to its actual real-world use. A series of payments made to the attorney's law office, timed with real precision alongside 3 separate major changes to Raymond Calloway's personal estate plan. To a trained forensic auditor with no personal stake in the outcome, that pattern raised an immediate and entirely obvious question that had nothing whatsoever to do with Marcus personally. Had a company officer used corporate funds for a personal estate matter that directly benefited himself as an individual? That single question, once formally raised inside an official audit report, triggered mandatory disclosure to the bank's own legal department, and from there, quietly, to the company's insurers, and eventually, inevitably, to the state office that formally handles fiduciary abuse cases involving elderly residents across the state. Derek never once saw any of this coming, because he had spent 2 entire years so completely focused on controlling the narrative around his own father that he never seriously considered his brother might simply outwait him patiently and win everything back through a completely different door, one that had nothing at all to do with their father's will. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. But even this careful, patient plan was not the true ending Marcus had originally imagined for himself, because once that formal audit officially opened, something surfaced from deep inside the family's own history that changed the entire shape of this story permanently. Once the state's office formally opened a full inquiry into potential fiduciary abuse, investigators did something Marcus's own private team had never possessed the legal authority to do themselves. They searched Renee Doyle's old employment records in full, along with Raymond's former home, for anything at all relevant to his true mental state at the exact time each individual document had been signed. Inside a box of Raymond's personal belongings that Vanessa had quietly kept in her garage, completely untouched since the funeral, investigators discovered a small handheld digital voice recorder Raymond had used privately for years to leave himself simple daily reminders. On that recorder was a message from 14 full months before his death, recorded late one night, in a voice that was noticeably slow, but entirely lucid and clear. Raymond talked quietly about missing Marcus. He talked about feeling genuinely confused by paperwork Derek kept bringing him to sign without much explanation. And near the very end of the recording, he said, almost speaking only to himself in the dark, that he sincerely hoped Marcus knew the company was still supposed to be half his, no matter what anybody else ever told him otherwise. That single recording never should have mattered much to a courtroom in any strict technical or legal sense, since it was not directly part of any of the actual signing appointments themselves, and skilled lawyers can argue endlessly about what one recording truly proves about a person's state of mind on 3 entirely separate, later dates. But it mattered enormously, in a deeply human way, to everyone in that family who eventually heard it play, especially Vanessa, who broke down completely upon first learning of its existence, and who, 2 full weeks later, voluntarily handed investigators a series of old emails between Derek and the attorney that she had personally found on a shared family computer years earlier and never fully understood the true significance of, until this exact moment. Those emails removed any remaining ambiguity from the entire case. Derek had explicitly instructed the attorney, in writing, to keep the language about Marcus's supposed financial instability vague enough to comfortably hold up under scrutiny later, a phrase that made unmistakably clear Derek had always known there was no real financial instability to point to at all, and never had been. Vanessa filed for divorce exactly 8 weeks later. She and Derek had 2 teenage children together, and in the difficult months that followed, she made a decision that genuinely surprised almost everyone involved, including Marcus himself. She cooperated fully and completely with both the state's formal investigation and Marcus's own civil claim to restore the original family trust, not out of any personal desire for revenge against her husband, but because, in her own words, she said simply that she could no longer look her own children in the eye while quietly protecting what he had done to his own family. The state's formal inquiry ultimately did not result in any criminal charges being filed. Proving elder financial exploitation to a full criminal standard is notoriously difficult under most state laws. and prosecutors eventually declined to pursue the case criminally, a common and often deeply frustrating outcome in cases exactly like this one across the country. But the civil case told an entirely different story. With the completed audit findings, Renee's detailed testimony, the recovered emails, and the recording all combined together into one unified picture, a judge formally voided the final trust amendment as the direct product of undue influence and restored the original 50-50 structure Raymond had carefully set up an entire decade earlier. By that point, though, there was barely a company left worth splitting between them. The loan default, the bank's now deeply cautious posture, and the serious reputational damage from a public fiduciary abuse inquiry had driven away two of Callaway Freight's largest long-term shipping clients. And the business Raymond had spent 40 full years of his life building was ultimately sold, 18 months after his death, to a regional competitor for roughly a third of what it had once been worth. Marcus received his fully restored half of the final proceeds. He did not use any of that money to try to rebuild the company himself, or to install himself as an owner somewhere else entirely. Instead, he used a meaningful portion of it to quietly endow a small scholarship fund in his late mother's name at the local community college, something she had talked about wanting to do for years and had simply never had the resources to start on her own. Derek, for his part, walked away from everything with his own restored half of a company now worth a third of its former value, a fully finalized divorce, and a personal reputation in their hometown that would follow him closely for the rest of his natural life. Nobody involved went to prison. Nobody involved got everything they originally wanted. That, as it turns out, in case after case just like this one, is what real revenge actually tends to look like in the real world. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Marcus and Derek saw each other exactly one more time after the entire case finally closed, standing quietly at their father's grave on what would have been Raymond's 75th birthday. They did not argue with one another. According to Marcus, Derek simply said that he was sorry, and Marcus told him honestly that he believed he genuinely meant it now, in that moment, but that meaning it now did not undo 2 full years of a dying, confused man being told repeatedly that his own son didn't love him enough to visit. The two brothers have not spoken again since that day at the cemetery. There is a version of this story where Marcus takes his own brother straight to court, wins a larger financial settlement in front of a judge, and simply walks away richer for it in the end. That particular version plays out in a great many families across this country every single year, and it very rarely feels like true justice to the actual people living through it. It usually just feels like more lawyers, more wasted years, and more money spent proving a point that everyone involved already knows, deep down, to be true anyway. Marcus chose a slower, quieter kind of consequence instead, one built almost entirely out of patience and paperwork, rather than open anger or public accusation. Whether that particular choice truly counts as revenge in the end, or something closer to simple accountability, is a genuinely worthwhile question to sit with for yourself. So, here is what I want to know from you personally. If you found yourself in Marcus's exact position, sitting in that lawyer's office, hearing for the first time that everything had already been quietly signed away without your knowledge, would you have sued immediately without hesitation, or would you have chosen the slower, more patient road he ultimately decided to take instead? Tell me your honest answer down in the comments below, because I genuinely read every single one of them myself, and I am always curious how differently people tend to answer that exact question, depending on their own family's history. If stories about family, betrayal, and the price people pay for greed keep you up at night, stay with me. Subscribe now, because this one gets darker before it gets satisfying.